For today's talk. To start, I'd like to discuss management systems. So we'll look at the overall business risk. Then we'll go into a new approach to auditing. So those of you that may be part of a quality team or an audit team, there are some good best practices we'll be discussing regarding new innovations in auditing, specifically in line with ISO standards, but keep in mind that these are, once again, best practices, so you can utilize them in your own organization. Then we're going to do a quick check-in. This is near the middle of the presentation, where I'd like to actually get you guys engaged a bit. So because I didn't necessarily have a chance to create a poll, what I've done is I have a few questions in which I'd be open to attendees or participants sending in chat feedback. So I know we won't necessarily get through all of the feedback, but just encouraging if you have some input for the team or the group that we go over that together, okay? And then of course, we'll be looking at methodologies around risk management and certain tools and frameworks. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll do a final Q&A, okay? So something I wanted to just discuss right off the top is you don't necessarily need to be an expert in ISO to enjoy today's presentation. There are going to be some terms as well as standards I bring into the picture, but keep in mind that these are global best practices in different sort of verticals. So you can take away this information. I'll try to not necessarily refer to the standards in their technical terms, so such as ISO 27001, and relate it more to your business or the certain department or division that makes sense for you. Okay. So looking at our first slide here, I want to read out the definition of risk management. So it's defined as the identification, assessment, and economic control of those risks that endanger the assets and earning capacity of a business. So certain standards which we see globally that might have this ingrained risk-based approach of thinking and also drilling in or management would be environmental management, so ISO 14001. Historically, we've seen that environmental aspects, which would be certain areas which affect the environment. So you think of air aspects as well as water, soil, right? So ground, etc. So those have always been quite a bit of quite explicit. Also, health and safety. So health and safety has always had certain risks around injury or certain areas in which there might be certain major harm, right? And then within product design and life cycles, we're always looking at something that may be a risk to the actual development of a product or through its life cycle. So when we're looking at more quality management, where risk is now quite evident, and once again, as a best practice of the updated ISO quality management standard, which is ISO 9001, 2015, it's actually quite explicit. So what this means is now we're looking at overall business risk versus having silos, right, in different departments. So we're taking more of a strategic approach, which in all essence is very important in today's environment. As we all know, we're quite a global connected type of world now, right? With many different cultures, many different businesses that may have touch points or affect one another. So to be able to see strategically certain risks, whether it's present or future, is very important to be resilient as well as sustainable in today's market. So looking at the evolution of risk, this is an important area. As I had mentioned, there is certain standards that have always had a hint of risk. So of course, certain things like business continuity management. This is actually the first time that a new framework started. So the framework I'm discussing is on the right-hand side there. So all revised standards, besides medical device currently, are taking this new structure. What this is helping with is aligning, proper understanding, and also a simplified view of management systems. So an interconnectedness, right? Weaving processes together and seeing where certain areas make sense. And this also overlaps with your risk analysis or risk management. So once again, the evolution of business risk. So when we look underneath this new structure, it's 10 clauses in general. So from clause 1 to 10, we'll see that risk is actually interwoven within the clauses. It's specifically explicit underneath planning. So that makes quite a bit of sense, doesn't it? When we're looking at certain current risks or potential risks, we're trying to mitigate or at least bring those to the surface, that we're aware of what could affect the business, right, or the sustainability of an organization. So just to talk a little bit more about Annex SL, what it really means is structured layers. So there's an increased emphasis on achieving value for an organization and its customers. If you're curious about the actual clauses, that would be clause 4, 5, and 10. And then there's an increased flexibility on the creation and use of documentation, and this is throughout the entire standard. So especially in the 21st century, we know that there's a lot of different tools that organizations and individuals are able to utilize in order to communicate as well as save information. So one may be an intranet where your team is able to access certain forms or details or even links, right? Another area may be what we're seeing right here, so a type of picture or even a flow chart to acknowledge a certain work process or procedure. So something I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, this might not necessarily be new information, but business continuity management. So I had mentioned earlier in the presentation that this is where we first saw that new structured layer approach for the best practices. So within business continuity management, it tends to be a large umbrella for organizations to consider what we would call critical risk. So the type of risk that if there was a major problem, let's say within IT or supply chain security, etc., it's the ability for the business, when used properly, to bounce back quickly. So I have an example here from Canada, which might make sense about this concept. The city of Calgary, a few years back, it actually had a really large flood in the springtime. And due to them having a business continuity management plan, the city and the emergency personnel were able to bounce back and actually have the city back and running before what we call the Calgary Stampede. So that was only about a month away. They were able to clean up everything, have everything properly structured, right, and still have an excellent event due to their strategic planning and thinking. So I thought that was a fantastic example and quite a neat one for Canada too. And this is a bit of a hot topic right now too, is a lot of organizations, once again, because we're so interconnected globally, are starting to implement something, or at least the essence of business continuity management. So just to bring it to your attention once again, if it's something you're not necessarily aware of, it might be an area to look into and research a bit. So a business continuity plan should always include understanding your organization's capabilities, and of course the risks it faces. So this isn't just internally the risk, it's also externally. So even possible environmental large catastrophes such as floods, right, or earthquakes should be considered. So best practice is to conduct an internal threat assessment, and this helps to determine any vulnerability to possible hazards, emergencies, and also disruptions. So if you already have a business continuity plan, it's actually an excellent place to start for your overall risk analysis, okay? So if you look at it and then we start connecting further business risks, it can make a lot of sense and be less work. So don't recreate the wheel, right? So business management systems, just explaining it a little bit more, this is that high-level clause structure that I showed before. So regarding what we call Annex SL. So looking at process versus policy, that's something that's been really explicit now within the revised standards. What I wanted to highlight is underneath planning, the actions to address risk and opportunity. But it's also important to know that basically what's happening is risk is no longer siloed. It's not let's see here, a preventative action. So historical standards, just to let you know if you're not familiar, there was always preventative actions which were reactionary, right? Depending if something actually happened, we would then go back and create a control to help mitigate that situation from happening again. Well now, why don't we start looking at risks, even from the beginning? So at the beginning in 4 and 5, we see there's like a connected relationship between what we call context of the organization and leadership. So this is where management starts talking about looking at strategy, right? What are the business risks internally and externally that actually affect our organization or our people, our resources? So the key areas within this structure here and takeaways to look at risk, I would say, is underneath 6, planning, also at the beginning, 4 and 5, interconnected. And then also we want to see improvement, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, especially looking at tools and ways to do risk assessment and analysis, is that we're constantly looking to improve, right? And bring it back to the beginning, basically, in a loop, for a process loop. Now, just talking a little bit about the key changes once again. I mentioned that leadership, there's a greater involvement for visibility within leadership of an organization now, as well as the individuals that would take responsibility for managing teams or processes. So now we want to see leadership's vision or message align with the actual management system and integrate as a whole business strategy. So this is going to improve performance and also drive real value. So there's reasons why we actually look at these structures, right? And also what I would call ISO, the best practices of the globe, is that we're trying to improve not only our organization to stay competitive, but also to be progressive, right? To actually establish new concepts of building or seeing or moving forward. So something I wanted to mention, and it will be discussed a little bit later in the presentation, is a lot of times we see risk as being negative, right? But something that is important for you all to understand is risk can also be an opportunity. So this can actually bring innovation to a group or an idea. So it can help identify and absolutely manage to help with efficiencies, right? But also think creatively, that there's opportunities always presenting themselves when you're starting to do this analysis. Furthermore, doing proper risk analysis and review can actually bring return on investment and measurements with that enhanced performance, as well as efficiencies. And you're not necessarily having, for example, big breaches, right, or affecting your actual shareholders if you're a larger organization, or the general public, whatever your business may be. We're being way more proactive. So risk-based thinking, this can absolutely depend on the industry or culture you're in. So for example, if you have a progressive culture that may be looking to create something like a prototype or a software, you may be a little bit more comfortable with risk than something like a hospital or an organization that's creating a medical device that's high risk, such as a heart valve, right, or a pacemaker. So extremely important from the beginning when you're doing your risk-based thinking or review is to know your organization and know how you guys behave as a group and what are your goals, right? And we'll look at a strategy of brainstorming that can really be supportive to get, a few ideas started. So the risk-based thinking can really establish a proactive culture of improvement as well. So I did want to talk about some of the benefits. It assures consistency of quality, so whether that's goods or services, if you're into a product market or a service type organization. It actually improves customer confidence and satisfaction because you're doing the proper analysis, so we're not reacting once again, we're being proactive. And it enables organizations to respond to change effectively, proactively, and also protect the business as you grow. So looking at sustainability and resilience of your organization. And it also allows management and teams to make informed decisions based on analysis, right, and measurements. So looking a little bit deeper, it's important for us to understand that there's risks both internally and externally. So first we're going to look at external issues to take into consideration when you're starting to do risk analysis or risk-based thinking. So issues can include, but not limited, right? This is just to get your ideas out and thinking, is looking at suppliers, right? So an area of major risk is any type of supplier engagement or what I would call a handoff area. So considering supplier contracts, right, if you have many different vendors, if something goes wrong, that may affect your business. So I have another example is I've worked with a brewery here in Canada, which I think some of you might find funny since you're from America. And when working with them, one of the external risks that we were able to highlight is logistics. So because of this brewery located up north during winter times here in British Columbia, we tend to get a lot of snow around the mountains, right, or through the Rockies. And due to this, there was a couple instances where the production of beer, the supply, actually was delayed to get to Vancouver or some of the lower mainland in British Columbia due to avalanches and road closures. So in order to alleviate this risk, what the organization chose to do is actually make a surplus of supply so that at certain times where they knew the weather was going to be worse, they would actually have their trucks and transportation suppliers take more down to the city so that they wouldn't necessarily you know, when the time comes where there was a bit of a backlog, there would be additional supply. So I thought that was a pretty good strategy overall, and them thinking ahead, right, that they don't necessarily want to have this risk, which is affecting their business. Some other ones to consider, absolutely any type of legal or regulatory requirements. So that's a big one, right? Something that the current organization I'm working with, we're looking into is a new regulation in Europe. So GDPR, which many organizations that are dealing with Europe and specifically around information and data need to be aware of, right? So we proactively had been planning this change and transition, which is happening in May, for months now, talking to partners, etc. So I think it's really important as a group to be able to discuss these points and think about, you know, what are the current conditions, what's coming up in the future, and what do we need to establish in order to be successful. Now, internal issues. Here are some of the areas to consider as an organization. There can be such areas of importance with new training initiatives, right? So as we all know, in the 21st century, information tends to change and evolve very quickly. So being able to train or retrain individuals can be very a strong case, right, for companies. Also looking at organizational structure, culture, and roles. So this is an important one for smaller businesses I'd like to highlight. Let's say that there was a key manager or CEO that's retiring, looking at succession planning, right? So how do we do business? What's the framework? Do we actually have these processes documented? Can we hand this over so that our organization can pick up? And even if you think about business continuity management, it sounds funny, but if the main CEO of an organization that had all of that knowledge in his or her head passed away, how are we going to actually pick up and run the business like we did yesterday, right? So an important one, sometimes overlooked. New products and service or equipment. I have a couple other examples here of more of a manufacturing company where they invested in a huge piece of equipment from Germany. It was over $100,000, and they actually had planned for the project to have the actual technicians to work on the equipment and actually implement it inside of the business at a certain time. But unfortunately, they didn't think about logistics once again. So a supplier, which would be the actual freight ship it's coming from. So due to this, they were delayed by a few weeks. And unfortunately, everything, all their timing had to be rejigged, as well as the budget went over. And they, you know, it's almost like a domino effect at that point, where depending on what production they were supposed to be doing in, let's say, 2 weeks' time, is now failed, right, or delayed even more. So very important to do this. Just have a review of both your external and internal issues. So now we're going to look at some new approaches to auditing. If you're not necessarily an auditor, this is still helpful information, right? If you've ever been in a situation where you may get audited, right? Or even in an organization that has audits, just to understand a little bit of the structure. And this is more so about the revised approach when looking at management systems audits. So what I'd like to discuss on this slide is that on the right-hand side of the diagram, we're seeing that in order for an organization to improve, right, looking at that connection once again with leadership and strategy, we need to really take a processed approach. So looking at plan, do, check, act, or continuous improvement. This is quite a popular diagram, actually, which I'm sure many individuals that are a part of ASQ might be familiarized with. So PDCA Cycle, so plan, do, check, act, it's a process approach, and it's used quite a bit in quality management. It's a good visual to outline the process approach because, as we know, there are different steps to each area of a business and a plan, right, in order to execute and actually improve on it. So there are also going to be interrelated activities within this, looking at transforming inputs into outputs. What that mainly means is the information or the requirements going in, creating an output would be the actual final service or product. And this is a good way of just seeing a high-level overview of kind of what a management system is, right? So now we want to take in consideration risks too, align that with strategy, leadership, step by step. So examples of processes in general within a management system would be your internal audit. Also something called corrective actions. So that would be when an issue takes place, we want to correct it and put in a control in order to alleviate it or clear it out, right? Training management, document management, legal and regulatory requirements, customer requirements, incident management, risk analysis, and then performance management. So these are all linked to the management system or the business management system. I think it's important to keep in mind too that the purpose of standards such as quality management, which is ISO 9001, with the revision in this new structured layer approach, it hasn't necessarily changed. We've always been looking at risk, right? So if you've been comfortable within the quality management scene, right, and actually certified to ISO 9001, know that a lot of, I guess, customers I've talked to or individuals, they're a little bit worried about this whole risk analysis step, right? But I think as a team or as an individual, once we simplified and just reflected that it's something we probably are already doing within our organizations, it's not as scary. So a lot of individuals that are department heads or managers or executives, they're constantly thinking about business risk, right? So now we're just trying to capture that and make it a little bit more formal. So remember, you know, that piece when you're doing any of your own review. So a little bit about a new approach to auditing. There are some key changes, specifically in line, once again, with the ISO standards and this new revision. So quality management and continuous improvement are now at the absolute heart of the standards, specifically ISO 9001. So it's, once again, aligning with that strategic direction. Top management, they're going to have to demonstrate their commitment as well as their message. And there's a larger emphasis on their involvement, right? So overall accountability. So now they're responsible to actually ensure requirements or these processes are applied correctly and actually working, right? So it's great if we implement something, but we want to make sure that it's actually performing properly, right? And with that, there needs to be proper planning, execution, communication, as well as review. We also want to make sure that policies and objectives are compatible with the strategic direction. So what's neat now is because of leadership, they're the ones at the top, right, that are implementing these key let's say, strategies for the business. And what we'll start to notice is when we're talking to other divisions or individuals, does the same story run true, right? So whatever top management's created or discussed or communicated with the organization around that strategic plan or strategic direction should also be heard and available in other discussions with other individuals. So business risk and opportunity, it's now something that we're dealing with through planning, and it also connects with implementation right from the beginning, the context of the organization. So I had mentioned about that strategic view, that high-level view from the beginning of leadership and context of the organization. What I like to call this is line of sight. So top management, they're now going to be responsible of promoting risk management and the overall process approach. So management needs to be aware and needs to know their involvement and how they're accountable. Then they should determine who is managing what process. So I had mentioned before, one of the key areas where we can see risk is actually handoff areas. So if there's different departments where there's an interconnectedness, we should really look at those, what we call handoff areas. That can also be true for a production line, for example. So if you're manufacturing something where there is a key change is where there may be some risk and where we want to do a review or just be aware of what types of risks may be, present there. So risk assessment should be a formalized process, but it needs to be also what makes sense for your organization, right? So we talked about the culture and how comfortable your industry or your organization is with risk. So how much is enough, you may be asking. We'll actually look at that. It is a good question for upper management to ask themselves too, whether maybe they're going through change management even. Because if you're going through a bit of a evolution, transformation, or change, it's a good time for you to review, have we been too risky as a business or not risky enough, right? So looking at a few different types of tools now. The top there are more standards I'm familiarized with that I'd like to share as good foundational standards for review. There's the quality management standard, so that's the ISO 9001:2015. There's also fundamentals for vocabulary, the guidelines for auditing, that's ISO 19011. Risk management, there's a specific standard. This is for overall risk. There's also standards for medical risk, if there's any medical device type organizations on the call right now. There's also specific risk standards for that area. And then of course information security, so that's an area I'm familiar with, ISO 27001. And then of course tools to consider. You can utilize something called a gap analysis tool, so that would be reviewing how your current management system is in line with best practices such as standards or where you want to be, so highlighting areas of gaps and then going back and filling in those gaps, right, in order to improve your overall management system. There's checklists, of course. These are quite popular, and we will look at examples a little bit further. Flowchart examples. Sorry, there's a little bit of background noise right now. Organizational charts. This can be very helpful to establish who is the process owner. So for example, if I look at an organizational chart, I may see that there's an operational manager, right? Or an information securities manager, or whomever. this is a good place to start whether you're auditing or trying to better understand those handoff areas and what processes interconnect together is the org chart. And then, of course, there's software. So there's a huge amount of tools out nowadays for doing overall reviews, your risk analysis. Even something like Excel might be a good tool for you. So keep that in mind. And then most important, what I've written there is follow the processes. So what connects handoff areas tend to be more risky. So that will be on the slides for you. So I'd like to open up now to some group questions. And as I mentioned, you can write in the chat a few of your suggestions or things you're familiarized with. And maybe, Norval, if you could, or Norval, pardon me, could you read some of these feedback points?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. We'll just give it a second here.
Yeah, we'll give a few seconds here just to see.
Sure. Yeah, so what we're looking for is, do you currently use a risk analysis tool or framework? And if so, how or what is it? And if you do, what are risk analysis methods, models, or tools are you familiar with? And then, what's on your wish list and why? So I think this is a great opportunity for us to share amongst the group. So I saw FMEA, which is a very popular risk analysis tool. That's great. We'll actually look at that a little bit within the presentation. Is there any other ones?
Just saw SWOT come up. Bowtie and Monte Carlo.
Okay, fantastic.
RSA Archer Risk Management, transitioning from Excel spreadsheet-based FMEAs and risk assessments. Not familiar with that one.
Okay. And then SWOT, just to go over that, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a popular one. Okay.
Yeah, it looks like FMEA is pretty much the big one, you know, the most popular one that I'm seeing.
What about, or is there anybody that wants to share? Oh, we got another one here. Yeah, FMEA. Are there any risk analysis tools? This could even be a software or a type of structure that is on your wish list, and why? I think that's a good one to share, if you can think of anything. And maybe what we'll do is, I'd like to continue. So yeah, Archer software, yeah?
Yeah, we have to be a little bit mindful of time, too.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can always follow up with that, too. Now, what I'd like to discuss, more of a high-level risk management type of tool, which this is exceptionally good for all organizations or even small companies. It makes a lot of sense. And it's basically brainstorming. So what you want to do is have a group of what I would call the top managers or the process owners, and all go into a boardroom, right, and start discussing what actually is considered a key risk for your department or for your activities. And from there, what we want to do then is consider internal and external issues, right? So earlier in the presentation, we started looking at, okay, organizational context, or i.e. strategy. There's legal and compliance considerations. Your culture, absolutely. Process handoff areas, outsourced processes, resources, training, your financials, infrastructure, you name it. So once you start brainstorming as a group, what you can then do is start prioritizing and actually understanding what is highest priority to your organization and what is lowest. From there, you want to record or document. So in some cases, it might be minutes in a management meeting, right? Or even a picture of a whiteboard of what you guys have scribed. And then what would be important for the accountability is an agreement and sign-off. So everybody that's at the table saying, you know what, we agree with these risks. We understand that they're high, like on the list, and we want to prioritize them, and let's move forward, right? And set out a plan. And then, of course, have a review period. So based on ISO, that tends to be a minimum of once a year you do a review. But I've seen a lot of organizations that have implemented even Scrum-type mentalities where if a risk is present, you discuss it in real time. Now, if that seems like it's not an opportunity for your company or your group, you can also consider quarterly reviews, right, which may also be helpful. And then, of course, we want to put a plan into action. So it's great to record the risks, right, and prioritize them, but then what? We want to actually put it into action, as we see on the left-hand side there, through the different stages, and implement. And then, of course, assess its effectiveness. So we can all come up with great plans, right, and take that time, but is it actually helping the organization and our team and society, etc.? Or do we need to go back to the drawing board? And then looking at how we're actually measuring this. So you can utilize key performance indicators. Also, just noticing that that risk hasn't actually happened. That can be a measurement, right? If you've mitigated it properly. So this is a very popular type of structure called either likeliness and consequence or probability and impact. We see this it's quite popular in information security types of assessments, but it also can be very helpful in environmental or health and safety and overall risk. So a lot of times organizations, they'll utilize a risk assessment matrix. They'll look at the probability, the impact, if it's high, low, medium, and then also a response. Then on the right-hand side there, you see that we start plotting the actual probability and impact on a colored grid to show what would be the lowest priority and what's the highest. As well as when we think back to business continuity and the overall business effectiveness, we need to make sure that these high risks are controlled to the best of our ability. So a risk by its very nature is said to have a negative impact, but however, the size of the impact varies in terms of cost and impact on human health, life, and in other critical factors. There may be reasons where it actually helps with innovation, so keep that in mind. This chart allows you to rate potential risks on a two-dimension, and the probability that the risk will occur is represented on the axis of the chart, and the impact of the risk occurs on the other. So it gives you a really quick visual, right, for your team and considerations. This is also a very popular way of assessing risk, and a lot of times this can be the input of the actual likelihood and consequence structure or probability and impact. So I'll use information security as an example. It's important for an information security professional to think about, is this risk avoidable? Should we mitigate it? Should we transfer it or accept it? And then something else that's a newer concept is, can we transform the risk? So I'm going to go over each one of these points briefly. Assessing the risk it should be ranked based on the impact and likeliness of the occurrence. So we looked at that in the last slide. One form of strategic risk assessment is the risk is one of 4 risk responses, so mitigating the risk. Activities with a high likelihood of occurrence, but very small impact. So once again, mitigating it, very high likelihood, so this happens often. The best response would be to use a management control system to help with any type of risk or potential losses. There's also avoid risk, so there's opportunities where you can actually have activities where there's high likelihood of loss and a large impact. The best response would be to avoid this completely. So if possible, avoidance. Then there's also transfer risk. So this is a popular one if it's a high risk and you think that insurance may be the best solution. And then of course there's accept the risk. So the risk of doing business, right? If there is a certain risk that you've considered is actually just a normal part of your day-to-day or something that you believe doesn't have a high enough impact, you may simply try to accept. And then the transformation of risk. This is when we look through a creative lens at problem solving and innovation. So I actually just want to, instead of going into it too much, just give you an example. So in countries where national IDs aren't used as an all-purpose identifier, rates of identity theft are much lower than in the United States. So I'll kind of paint a picture on that, is that certain countries, because ID is not readily available for their population, or it's been so fraudulent, have found other innovations of actually doing ID checks without necessarily utilizing that formal ID. So looking at a questionnaire form, we're just going to go a little bit faster now. I'm sure most of you have seen questionnaire forms. This is a great way to be able to capture information, assess, and then action it. Risk assessment 5x5 matrix, very popular in multiple industries, similar to the likelihood and consequence, or as we see here, likelihood and severity, but we actually apply a numeral, or like a number to it, and then times it. So 5x5 would be 25, highest risk. 1 by 1, we have 1, right? Root cause analysis tools, so these are very popular, and why I wanted to share this specifically around today's presentation is historically root cause analysis such as 5Y has been used as more of like a preventative tool. So, or pardon me, a tool in which it's reactionary. But I think we can use root cause analysis from the beginning so that we actually discover key risks before they even happen. So I'd encourage you, if you're familiar with 5Y, or even if you're not, to think creatively around its application and usage. And then of course there's fishbone cause and effect diagrams. This can be a really positive way of seeing how processes are interconnected, how they influence one another, as well as what types of inputs and final outputs could create a problem. And it can also be used backwards too. So think of reverse engineering sometime. If there is a problem you're thinking of, let's see how it's interconnected. So that summarizes today's presentation. I think we have a couple minutes here. We're going to open it up so that you guys can provide some feedback or comments or questions.
Thank you, Vanessa. We're going to go ahead here and take a few of the questions. As you mentioned, we are running a little short on time. Let's see here, back up. Okay, what are ways in which top management can demonstrate supportive risk management that an auditor can verify?
So ways in which they can demonstrate is through a formalized management review, where they're proving accountability by discussing risk, and then also putting a next step. So whether they're the ones that's going to be implementing a plan towards, either mitigating or controlling that risk, or if they're requesting another department or individual to work through that.
Okay, let's see. We'll scroll down here. That's several comments. Okay, AT&T and Verizon are being investigated for collusion in preventing the deployment of technology to allow customers or consumers to switch carriers easily. How would you place this in a risk tool as a mitigation of risk or potential legal risk or transfer of risk?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that because it's something that's currently being investigated, I think it would be better to use examples that have happened, right? A lot of times these larger organizations, they should be doing proper risk review and looking at, overall principles in order to know who their key stakeholders are. So for example, with big telecoms, their true customer, when we look at quality management, is the user. So if I was doing the proper risk assessment, this is just my opinion, I wouldn't necessarily want to affect my customer. So I see this as a non-conformance.
Okay, somebody has a question about, can we see slide 23 again? Can you back up 4 slides?
Sure.
Oh, okay, to the questionnaire form, okay.
So just to be clear, this is an example, obviously, that I've taken off basically the web. It's not my own personal one. And I left the link there so we know the source. But what was the specific question around it?
I think somebody just wanted to see the slide again.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Yeah.
Looking at it as an example that maybe they could use in their own workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something where you could simply create an Excel spreadsheet, have key questions. So this one's specific around health and safety. So looking at the hazards, right, what might be the harm and how, and then look at actions, who to address it to, and then of course placing a date so that you can follow that along and when it was completed. So very similar to a corrective action type of step, if you're familiarized with that.
Okay, looks like we have time for one last question. This will be it. In the current environment where companies report quarterly, how can you get senior management to ignore short-term stock prices in favor of taking steps to address long-term risk resolution?
These are pretty heavy questions, guys. Well, I think that bringing things back to organizational culture, right? Lots of times I see an organization as an organism where each of the components creates the body or the structure, right? So if an organization's main purpose is to make positive financial gains in the short term, that is a strategic business decision for that organization. There may be some reasons for that too, right? Maybe they're ramping up, etc. looking to expand, and they need that money as capital. But there are other organizations, you think, with long-term strategies. They may be also culturally and organizationally a bit more mature, perhaps, right? But overall, I think that specific question, it's a little bit broad, right? And I don't want to necessarily put too much of my opinion on it or within the answer. So I hope you can respect that.
Okay, that looks like it's probably the last question that we have. We are a moment or so running past here. The next webinar that we have scheduled is Thursday, May 3rd. It's a week from this Thursday. It's How to Handle Large Data with Greg Carl, who's a continuous improvement engineer doing business as Resource Optimizer. I would like to thank Vanessa again for presenting for us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. We're also going to be getting the presentation out to everybody.
Yeah, when I go to send the follow-up email that has the link to the recording as well as the survey, I'll also attach the presentation to it, so that way everything will be together.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you. Other than that, I think we're pretty much wraps things up for today. Thanks to you all for participating with us. And as I mentioned, the next opportunity will be on Thursday, May 3rd. Until then, hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Thanks again. Bye now.